Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating question. Why is Kentucky the undisputed heart of American whiskey? Well, as we're going to see, the answer isn't just about having a good recipe. It's actually this highly specific, almost magical mix of natural resources, strict federal laws, and a really deep, resilient cultural history. We're going to explore the natural architecture of Kentucky bourbon, and I'm super excited to share this with you. Let's kick things off with a number that really sets the scale of what we're talking about here: 95%. Think about that for a second. 95% of the entire world's bourbon supply is crafted strictly within the borders of the bluegrass state. In our highly globalized world, where stuff is manufactured literally everywhere, this kind of geographic monopoly is just absolutely staggering. And, it heavily hints that there's something incredibly unique about this specific location. And just to mind-boggle you a little bit more with the sheer volume of this industry, let's talk about a record-breaking figure from early 2026. 16.1 million. That is the number of bourbon barrels currently aging in Kentucky warehouses. To put that into perspective for you, there are over 2.5 barrels of bourbon aging in Kentucky for every single human being actually living in the state. The barrels literally outnumber the people, which honestly sounds like a great party. Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1, the rulebook. What legally makes it bourbon? So before we look at the soil and the climate, we really have to look at the rigid framework. You can't just throw any random grain into a still and call it a day. Federal law actually mandates that the mash bill, that's the recipe of grains, must be at least 51% corn. That's a non-negotiable legal minimum. But Kentucky distillers know that corn is the absolute engine of bourbon's signature sweetness. So they frequently push this proportion way higher, often using upwards of 70% corn in their mash bills just to create those really distinct, globally recognized flavor profiles. But hey, the corn is just step one. The federal standards of identity are incredibly strict. Bourbon has to be produced entirely within the United States. It must be distilled to no more than 160 proof, entered into the barrel at a maximum of 125 proof, and then bottled at no less than 80 proof. But you know what the absolute most crucial requirement of all is? It must be aged in brand new charred oak containers. This single rule is basically a game changer, responsible for imparting 100% of the bourbon's rich amber color and the vast majority of those sweet, complex flavors we all love. Moving right along to part 2, the terroir, limestone and perfect water. Now that we've got the rules down, let's talk about the earth itself, the terroir. Kentucky sits right on top of a massive bed of blue limestone, and this is totally critical because if you try to make whiskey with water that contains iron, it will literally turn the spirit black. It just completely ruins the fermentation process. So Kentucky's limestone aquifers act like this massive natural water filter, stripping out all that harmful iron while simultaneously infusing the water with beneficial minerals like calcium and magnesium. These minerals, they're essentially superfood for the yeast, absolutely perfecting the fermentation process. Which brings us to part 3, climate as a flavor engine, the Kentucky thermal swing. So, we've got the perfect water, but what about the air? Well, we call this the Kentucky thermal swing. Kentucky's kind of unpredictable weather isn't a hindrance at all. It's actually a vital, active ingredient in the aging process. You see, bourbon enters the barrel as a completely clear liquid. They call it white dog. And most of these storage warehouses or rickhouses are not climate controlled. So during Kentucky's really hot, humid summers, that intense heat causes the liquid inside to expand, forcing it deep, deep into the pores of the heavy number 4 alligator char of the oak barrel. Then, during the cool winters, the wood contracts, squeezing that spirit right back out. It's literally breathing the wood in and out, extracting all those rich vanillins, caramelized wood sugars, and deep, gorgeous colors, year after year. And this aggressive thermal swing brings us to one of my absolute favorite, most poetic terms in the whole industry, the angel's share. Because those barrels are porous and that summer heat is so intense, a pretty significant portion of the liquid simply evaporates right through the wood up into the atmosphere over the years. And because water sometimes evaporates faster than the alcohol under these specific conditions, the bourbon that gets left behind in the barrel often emerges at an even higher proof, just incredibly heavily concentrated with flavor. Now, while this is an absolute marvel of natural chemistry, we can't forget the incredible human sweat involved here. Generations of highly skilled workers have physically rolled and managed these 500-pound charred American white oak containers. Without this backbreaking manual orchestration, and without that wood imparting all those rich notes of tobacco, caramel, and vanilla, bourbon as we know it simply wouldn't exist. Now for part 4, corn, oak, and agriculture, cultivating the native spirit. Shifting our focus just a bit, we really have to recognize the massive agricultural footprint required to feed the bourbon beast. The liquid in your glass is directly connected to the soil and the forests of the Commonwealth. To keep up with exploding global demand, Kentucky distillers actually purchase over 17 million bushels of corn annually. And what's really incredible is that 75% of this is sourced locally, right from Kentucky farmers. Because a lot of Kentucky's terrain is highly erodible land, this massive demand has actually driven a huge adoption of sustainable no-till agriculture. It ensures that producing America's spirit doesn't end up destroying America's soil.
But hey, it's not just about the corn, it's the wood too. Remember, federal law states every single barrel must be a brand new charred oak container. That single-use requirement places immense pressure on American white oak forests. The industry is super aware of this, which is exactly why collaborative efforts like the White Oak Resilience Act are currently in motion. It's a huge effort to ensure we don't face a catastrophic shortage of this vital natural resource in the decades to come.
And this brilliantly illustrates how a local craft turned into a global powerhouse, bringing us to part 5, a global cultural symbol, from the frontier to the world stage. If we trace the chronological journey here, distilling was originally brought to Kentucky way back in the late 18th century. Settlers basically used it as a way to preserve their surplus grain. It was literally a frontier survival skill. But by the mid-20th century, it had grown so iconic that in 1964, the U.S. Congress officially declared it a distinctive product of the United States. And then in 1999, the launch of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail officially formalized its status as a premier cultural destination.
Just think about the sheer density of distilleries packed into the state. This massive concentration translates to staggering economic might today. By early 2026, the bourbon industry reached a record $10.6 billion economic impact in Kentucky. $10.6 billion. It generates over 22,500 jobs and provides hundreds of millions of dollars that heavily support local and state tax revenues.
And beyond the production itself, this really unique history has spawned a multi-billion-dollar tourism industry. The Kentucky Bourbon Trail attracts millions of visitors from all over the world. These visitors spend up to $1,200 each during their trips, pouring revenue into local hotels, restaurants, and shops. It's completely revolutionized local communities all across the state.
Ultimately, bourbon is so much more than just a drink. As Congress declared, it's a legally protected piece of American heritage. It's entirely bound by the rigid federal laws we discussed earlier, sure, but it only reaches its peak potential because of that unique natural terroir, the iron-free limestone water, and that aggressive thermal swing found right there in Kentucky.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty vital question. As global demand for this incredible spirit surges to all-time highs, and as our natural resources, especially those vital white oak forests, are stretched, can the perfect natural architecture of Kentucky bourbon sustain its delicate balance? It's a really fragile intersection of climate, agriculture, and tradition, and it's definitely something you should ponder the next time you take a sip. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.